So my name is Vivek Venkataraman, and I'm an assistant professor of anthropology and archaeology at the University of Calgary in Canada.
And we're here to talk about hunter-gatherer society, which is you study, along with primates. You're also a primatologist, non-human primates. And we're here to talk mostly about hunter-gatherer societies, which are, in the first place, interesting in their own right. In the second place, we really want to know what they have to say about human origins. That's one reason to be interested in them. But there's another reason to be interested in them, which is that they say something we think about modern democracy. And we're going to cover all of those. We might stretch it out to two podcasts. But to begin, Vivek, tell us how you became an anthropologist and how you kind of wandered into this kind of work and a little bit of your pedigree.
Sure, yeah, I took a pretty roundabout approach to becoming an anthropologist. So when I was at university, I went to the University of Chicago. I wanted to go there to study the great books curriculum that it's sort of known for. And I became a physics and philosophy major because I wanted to learn as much math and get as much quantitative skill as possible, but also study the big questions in philosophy. And so that's what I ended up doing for 4 years. It was really great. But toward the end of university, I was actually working on my bachelor's thesis on high pressure physics. Um,
I didn't know this about you, so this is
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. Well, it's sort of deep history at this point. Um, and one of my friends recommended that I take an anthropology class. So I took a class with a guy named Russ Tuttle, who was very active in the 60s and 70s on sort of human origins. And it was called Apes and Human Evolution. I really enjoyed it. And I thought, oh, this is a really cool field of study. I took another anthropology class called Celebrity Science and Paleoanthropology, where I learned about all the interesting feuds and dynamics between famous paleoanthropologists. And then I also took another class with a historian named Robert Richards, who's written really
Know him
excellent,
well. I know him
yeah,
well.
yeah,
He
biographies
has
of,
my highest respect. He's one of the great historians of evolution.
yeah, absolutely. So I took a class called Evolution of Mind and Morality, where we learned about the sociobiology debate. And that I think was really my transformation toward becoming an anthropologist, learning about sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, because
Well, not
during the
just
Great Books
Vivek, not
curriculum,
not just an
yeah.
anthropologist, but an evolutionary anthropologist. So what you know, and I think what some but not all of our audience knows, is the very complicated intellectual terrain of culture of anthropology, including cultural anthropology, and coming to terms with Darwin's theory of evolution, and that's something that, as a discipline, is
Mhm.
still like, from my perspective, total chaos. But
Yeah.
anyhow, that's another story. Please continue with your own.
Well, no, no, it is. It's a fascinating intellectual history, and that's what's really actually drawn me to it. Because so at the same time in university, I was studying the great books, reading philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, all the way up to the modern day. And I had this kind of suspicion, even though I probably couldn't articulate it at the time, that there was something incomplete about these accounts, where you kind of just argue about what Plato and Aristotle are saying from a kind of logical um, perspective. And I thought, if we want to talk about what it means to be human, we have to incorporate evolutionary theory. And that's why this class on sociobiology and evolutionary psychology was so appealing to me, because it was like, look, we can explain, or we can try to explain everything or a lot through these evolutionary approaches. So that was kind of my shift into anthropology. And uh, as I was finishing undergrad, I was reading a book by Robert Sapolsky called The Primate's Memoir, about doing field work with baboons in Africa. And so I thought, well, that's what I want to do. And so I ended up getting a field position studying gelada monkeys in the Ethiopian highlands. And I mean, frankly, I had barely been camping. I grew up in a city. But at the age of 22, I decided I need to go live in a tent for a year. So I went to the Ethiopian highlands and studied gelada monkeys from dawn to dusk.
These
I
are
still
baboons,
work
right?
there
They're
now.
baboons. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it depends who you ask. They're not technically baboons because they're not in the genus Papio. They're in their own genus Therapithecus,
Okay.
because they have this very kind of derived lifestyle, this genus focusing on grass. But I would later learn that they're actually a pretty important and prominent model in human evolution because they live in these really large herds, multi-level societies, in which there's a lot of social tolerance. And so there are uh, ideas out there that maybe human society went through some kind of stage like that, where you have polygynous one male units living close by each other.
Yeah.
Um, so that was kind of interesting. It wasn't until I went to grad school at Dartmouth College where I started to work with hunter-gatherers, and I was very interested in the time at the diversity of of human locomotion. The fact that most studies on human locomotion are done with people on treadmills, but of course, most of our evolution has been in the context of not wearing shoes, not walking on asphalt, walking on uneven terrains on dirt and forest
So this
and
is Dan
climbing
Lieberman,
trees.
Dan Lieberman territory.
Yeah. And I would later kind of work with Dan Lieberman a bit when I was a postdoc at Harvard. But I was really interested in tree climbing, so I thought, okay, well, I'd like to go observe a society in which this is still a common behavior. And there was an anthropologist at Dartmouth called Kirk Endicott who had worked with a group called the Batek in Malaysia. And so I went. I mean, it's a real testament to the flexibility of the graduate program there that I went to Malaysia without having any idea what my goal was or what I was doing other than I just wanted to explore. But I think that was actually fantastic in retrospect because I went and I just lived with people for months at a time during grad school. I learned a few languages in Malaysia and really got to know these societies quite well. And so the Batek are a hunting and gathering society that lives in central peninsular Malaysia, and they still practice hunting and gathering to this day. And that kind of got me kickstarted in thinking about hunter-gatherer societies and how they have shaped human evolution. And then from there, I did a postdoc at Harvard, kind of split between Dan Lieberman and Richard Wrangham's lab. And then following that, I went to the Toulouse School of Economics for another postdoc. So when we talk about anthropology as being the most scientific
Vivek,
of the
before we
humanities,
dive in,
yeah, sure.
um, a school of the economics part, just to say a little bit about that. That
Well,
might
there's
become relevant.
yeah. Well, there's an Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, which is kind of a branch of the Toulouse School of Economics, and it was founded just a couple years ago as a interdisciplinary institute where they hire um, uh, 3-year postdocs to come in from all these different fields, from mathematics, economics, sociology, anthropology, and so on, to come together and sort of share ideas. So, I mean, I think it is really what being an intellectual is all about, and it's a just a fantastic environment, and I really cherished my years there. There's so much to be gained by just sitting in a room and seeing how people approach problems differently.
Yeah, so I mean, so fascinating to hear this. Why? Because I think, when I put on my economics hat, I'm saying all the time that neoclassical economics is based in Newtonian physics and this and that, and so the whole physics model um, shifting to an evolutionary model is what's needed today in economics, and your own personal story seems to cover the same trajectory, starting out in physics and ancient philosophy, all the way up to the present, grounded in anthropology and evolution. But then coming full circle to a topic like economics is what certainly that's my world. And but with that in mind,
Yeah.
let's zero in a little bit on on hunter-gatherer um,
Mhm.
society. So how do you want to begin? I mean, let's just talk about hunter-gatherer society on its own terms, modern hunter-gatherer societies, and then try to make the connection as to what they can tell us about human origins.
Yeah, well, it would help to just reverse that slightly, just to start, which is to say that why do we care about hunter-gatherers? Why are they particularly important in reconstructing human evolutionary history? And um, the answer to that, I think, is that for most of human history, for as long as we have been a species, humans have been hunter-gatherers. So that goes back 300,000 years up to maybe 10,000 years ago, when agriculture emerged. And obviously, there's kind of debate and some looseness around this, but this is kind of how we've classically thought about it. But hunting and gathering probably evolved even before that, maybe not in its kind of modern form, but some think that hunting and gathering goes back maybe to Homo erectus, in which case it's well over 99% of our genus and species history that we
Well, what
span as
what else would it
hunter-gathered.
be? I mean, why would there be any controversy about that? What else would there be but hunter-gatherer
Well, I think it's mainly
stretching back?
maybe kind of a terminological or a semantic issue of, would we call Homo erectus um, hunter-gatherers in the same way that we have hunting and gathering now? Because it probably evolved in a very mosaic, piecemeal fashion, and of course, given the vagaries of the fossil record, it's hard to know what kind of hunter-gatherer Homo erectus um, was. But certainly, it was gathering and hunting wild foods, and in that sense, it was a hunter-gatherer, and it would have been a central place forager. I think most people would agree on that. But you didn't have the kind of later brain expansion and development of cumulative culture as we see later on. So anyway, I think that's mostly kind of semantic thing of how we define hunting and gathering.
Okay.
But the bigger picture is that hunting and gathering shaped the way that we look. It shaped our anatomy, our physiology, as well as our psychology, and therefore we need to understand the adaptive problems that hunter-gatherers face and how they solve them.
Right. And so, I mean, to draw upon Richard Wrangham's work, one of your mentors, who in turn was drawing upon Chris Boehm, someone who I interacted with quite a lot. There's um, the fact that humans are so much more cooperative. There's something about human hunter-gatherer groups that's ultra cooperative in comparison, for example, with chimpanzees and even with bonobos. That comparison is interesting, but Wrangham tells us in his book, The Goodness Paradox, that naked aggression is over 100 times more common in a chimp community than
Hmm.
in a small scale human society. And so that's one of the great things to explain is how did hunter gatherers way back, probably stretching way back, become so cooperative? And this has led to what's sometimes called a guarded egalitarian hypothesis. Would you like to expand upon all of that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's back up a little bit. Basically, when you look at most non-human primates, aggression and dominance, mainly from the male perspective, is an adaptive strategy, and it gets you reproductive success, right? Which is one of the main drivers of evolution of natural selection, right? So one of the big puzzles then is, how do you tamp down um, aggression, right? Because this is always going to be kind of the more successful strategy, so to speak. So how do we have selection for kind of being nicer? And Wrangham built on an earlier argument by Chris Boehm, anthropologist who just passed away in the past couple of years, um, who proposed this idea of counter dominance, that at some point in human evolution, that instead of having the bully, and it would be a male bully that could dominate the group, that all the others in the group said, hey, this isn't fair, this isn't right, and they could team up um, on that bully, and as the name counter dominance suggests, sort of reverse that hierarchy. So it's called reverse dominance hierarchy. And Boehm outlined this in a series of papers in the 90s, as well as in a book, Hierarchy in the Forest. And it's a really um,
And
fascinating argument.
Moral origins
Moral
in
origins as well.
2011. Yeah, a little
Right.
biographical note.
Yeah, sure.
I had a collaboration with Chris. We wrote a grant together to the John Templeton Foundation, and in that grant, I applied these principles to religion. That led to my book, Darwin's Cathedral. And that was my assignment for the grant was religious groups, and his assignment was hunter-gatherer groups, and that led to moral origins. So I go back a
Right.
long way with Chris, and I think always have loved his work on the topic. Also, a little bit about
Hmm.
gender that I think you've singled out males, but if I could just channel Sarah Hurdy,
Sure.
and women are all females are also competitive, et cetera, et cetera, and so that the kind of the competitive element, disruptive competitive element, it's very male, but it's also can be very female in many primates. Would you agree with that? Just so that we could just cover that as we
Yeah,
move
I would
along.
certainly agree with that. The reason I was focusing on males there is because that's the main part of Wrangham's argument. He
Yeah,
argues that
yeah,
it's
yeah.
really like the male aggression that is the issue that needs to be solved. And what you see in non-human primate groups is like, for example, if you have polygynous primate groups and you have takeovers and so on, um, there isn't a whole lot of scope for female choice in these cases. I mean, there are some exceptions, but they typically don't help to decide the outcome of these dominance interactions. And I've seen this in geladas myself. Certainly, later on in human evolution, or when we're talking about these counter dominance dynamics, there's no doubt that females could be playing a prominent role. I don't think it figures that prominently in Wrangham's argument. So I think it's good to kind of distinguish that and like who we're talking about here. Yeah.
Yeah, and in general, as we're talking, I think that I mentioned Sarah Blufford Hurdy and her work on basically providing we're kind of rounding out Wrangham's argument and talking about childcare and mothers and others and so on and so forth as part of the basically complementary parts of the story. But let's continue with
Yeah.
so we have this idea of counter dominance.
Right. From
Um,
Boehm. Yeah.
yeah, and
Mm.
so we have Boehm's argument for counter dominance. Now it's going to be elaborated by Richard Wrangham. Another piece of this, I think, is that just the need for cooperation was greater in a savanna environment than in a forested environment. And Lesley Newson and Pete Richerson make this point in their book, A Story of Us, among others. And I think
Hmm.
it's quite plausible that if you're on a savanna environment, the sheer need to cooperate is greater. Is that something that you would agree with and that you've also contributed to?
Yeah, well, I would say that that sort of argument goes way back in terms of the savannah being a more challenging environment in many ways compared to say um, a rainforest. I think that the thinking on this issue isn't so black and white these days as rainforest versus savannah, but it's worth pointing out that when we look at these prominent causal theories of human origins that they're really these days kind of about resources and how resources are distributed and how that would have impacted social behavior and organization. And one of the prominent theories by Hillard Kaplan and others really focuses on um, the shift toward eating more dispersed but higher value and more challenging to extract resources. So to make it concrete, this would be things like moving from a fruit and leaf diet in a forest in some kind of hypothetical ape ancestor to feeding on, let's say, large underground tubers out in the savannah, right? It might require some tool use. It might require more forward thinking and planning. And you also get kind of a bigger reward from it. So, so that hypothesis, uh, which is kind of a life history uh, hypothesis, and this is outlined in a 2000 paper in Evolutionary Anthropology, is that this is kind of what contributed to the longer developmental period of humans. That when you switch to extractive foraging, that could be linked with the savanna environment, you need more time to develop the strength and the skills to do that.
And we
Um,
have these
yeah.
famous studies that
Mhm.
and hunter-gatherer individuals don't start, they're not net positive in terms of their foraging until they're like 16 or 18. And until then, they're actually relying
Yeah,
upon the
I would say even later, right? I think
amazing. That's
about
they,
the
they're
age
not
of
even
20.
pulling their
Yeah.
weight. until they're young adults, even in modern human terms, with a shorter life expectancy. That's just mind-boggling. Is that kind of care extends that extended care, which does take a village. There's another point. That's just not your nuclear family isn't doing that. Not nearly.
Yeah, exactly. And I love bringing up this point when I teach about human life history to undergraduates who, um, are kind of in the process of being weaned off of their parents. But I tell them, well, it's okay. Like, hunter-gatherers are dependent on their parents as well, kind of into their 20s. You shouldn't feel so bad. It's kind of part of being human, actually. It's okay. But yeah, it is a kind of spectacular fact, and I think there's another part to it, which is on the later end of the lifespan. So this theory has also been proposed to explain why we have this long post-reproductive lifespan, which is that if you are kind of a net if you're kind of a mooch on the system, then this means that somebody needs to be overproducing if you're underproducing. And so, in midlife, human hunter-gatherers are quite prolific foragers. In other words, they get really big surpluses, and this is something that chimpanzees do not do, right? They're only getting food for themselves, except for these kind of rare hunting events. Um, and this this high level of production in midlife leads to the subsidization of younger and older individuals. And older individuals contribute in other ways. They help to share labor. They help to take care of grandkids. Um, this links to the grandmother hypothesis, sort of. And so, anyway, to get back to your question, it's all about resources and foods when we think about causal models of human origins, and the shift to a more meat-based diet and the shift to tubers are the kind of thing that people point to. There was a shift in human evolution to those kinds of resources, and the idea is that these kind of reshaped our life history in important ways.
Yeah, and it all depends on the ability to solve the all-important free riding and cheating and exploitation problems, and so and that's where reverse dominance comes in. And also, it explains the title of Chris's book, Moral Origins, that when we look at moral systems, modern human moral systems, that's what we see. I had a memorable podcast with Simon Blackburn, who's a famous moral philosopher,
Mm.
um, and uh, and that began in the most wonderful way. I said, Simon, before we talk about evolution, just define morality for me as you would in a elementary philosophy class. And he said, well, there's two dimensions. There's a compulsory dimension. That's ways you should behave with consequences if you don't. And there's a voluntary dimension, our just desire to, our altruistic impulses um, to help others. And I just love that because that's what you expect from an evolutionary perspective. Is in the first place, there must be agreed upon ways of behaving with consequences if you don't. That's where the reverse dominance um, comes in. And that if you have that, then it becomes safe to be pro-social. Then if you do want to extend yourself, then you're not going to be exploited thanks to the compulsory part of the
Mhm.
system. So the compulsory part and the voluntary part go together. And this is all, I think, is what we can say, what a philosopher such as him would say, just, this is what morality is. And what we can say as evolutionists, this is what evolved. And this was the consequence of um, of reverse dominance or counter dominance. That's the basic concept that Chris developed, and then Richard developed it further, and also brought in this concept of self-domestication because in the meantime, in the evolutionary literature, the whole concept of domestication uh, came in, and the idea that we're a self that basically we bred docility among ourselves, just the way we did with our companion animals, and that also, as we'll get to, there's a physiological, anatomical signature to this because domestication, it turns out, although it's behavioral, there's a whole bunch of physical correlates that come along with it called the domestication syndrome. And thanks to that, we could look at the human fossil record and we could actually pinpoint the time in which uh, our species, our lineage became self-domesticated. So you know more about it than I do. So please cover that ground in any way that you like, um, bringing in Richard's work in addition to Chris's work.
Sure, yeah. So maybe we can just outline first how Wrangham kind of extended Boehm's argument. Um, One thing he added was emphasizing the importance of capital punishment as a kind of logical result of this counter dominance. So it's not simply that uh, a bully gets ostracized, but I mean that does and can happen. But sort of at the extreme end is that they actually get murdered, right? And so you're actually removing, according to Wrangham, the the genes of a more reactively aggressive bully male. And it's worth noting here that Wrangham introduced an important distinction between reactive aggression, which is just kind of immediate, kind of untargeted aggression, like you might see two dogs fighting in a dog park, versus a proactive aggression, which is kind
Cool
of
and
planned and
calculated.
strategic, yeah, like Hannibal Lecter style, right? So the argument is that you are removing these kind of highly reactive males, but you're doing it through the process of counter dominance, which requires coordination and cooperation and and planning, and in fact may be premised on the the appearance of language. So you can have individuals getting together and plotting basically to overthrow somebody. And he brings in ethnographic evidence from hunter-gatherers, which is quite clear and really fascinating of when you find someone in these groups that can qualify as a bully or a murderer.
Incorrigible bully.
Yeah, exactly. There's a very specific way that they go about taking care of these people, which is they talk to the kin of that individual, and then they all agree as a group, and this kind of goes to Boehm about this
This guy's
moral
got to go.
community, and they decide, okay, this guy needs to get taken out, and then oftentimes it's the kinsmen
The
who
kinsmen that
actually
do it.
take the person out, and so it's really a decision of the whole group, um, and this is the way that you kind of get rid of these bullies, and so Wrangham is proposing this as um, as a mechanism through which self-domestication can be achieved. So a way in which he extended Boehm was to say that Boehm has been providing an argument all along, slightly modified, to help explain why humans became so nice, and he draws parallels not only with domesticated animals with this constellation of domesticated traits, but also parallels between chimpanzees and bonobos. Bonobos are self-domesticated compared to
The
chimpanzees,
chimps.
or
Right.
so the argument goes. And so you know, we can unpack any of those if you want, but that's the basic outline of the argument.
Well, I would think that the would be nice now to see draw upon your own experience to see how is this manifested in the hunter-gatherer groups that you've studied and the modern literature. And then after we do that, I want to note that the kind of the uh, y- um, changes taking place in the interpretation of hunter-gatherer societies, um, beginning with a famous conference, Man the Hunter Conference, which kind of set this idea
Hmm.
that hunter-gatherers were like these little teeny tiny groups wandering the landscape, um,
Right.
to a lot more scale to society. So I want to get there. But first of all, share some of your own experience. What does reverse dominance look like in the people that you've lived with? And then we'll proceed to some of the current developments in anthropology, including books such as The Dawn of Everything, which I know we want to talk about.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think there's a nice connection here because I think it leads into a broader discussion of egalitarianism and its manifestation in hunter-gatherer societies. And this ends up being one of the pillars of a famous kind of definition of what's called the nomadic style that was arrived at the Man the Hunter conference. So I'll just answer your first question about kind of its manifestations from like a anecdotal perspective. So the group I work with, the Batak in Malaysia, they are famously egalitarian and mainly along kind of gender lines. So when Kirk Endicott and his wife Karen Endicott went to work with the Batek in the early to mid 70s, um, they were kind of brought up on a tradition, not surprisingly, that kind of emphasized male leadership, right? And so when they arrived working with the Batek, they were kind of surprised to find that the person who held the most, and this is rather informal, the most kind of power was a woman in this group. So their ethnography ended up being titled "The Head Man Was a Woman: The Gender Egalitarian Batek of Malaysia." And in kind of formal terms, the head man was actually a man in this group, but that was a government designated head man of, they picked somebody who they would deal with. And you see this story over and over again in ethnography of the whole, like, take me to your leader, and everyone just looks at them puzzled. It's like, well, we don't have
We don't
one, at
have
least in
them.
those terms, right? Um, so that kind of forms the basis of their study to examine the manifestations of egalitarianism, and this group is still quite egalitarian despite changes through time, right? It's been 50 years since those studies have been conducted. But one of the fascinating things about hunter-gatherer societies is um, is in a sense their kind of permissiveness, uh, that they kind of let each person do what they want to do. There's nobody bossing each other around. And if you do that, well, you kind of get ignored, right? There's no power to those words. These are kind of nomadic groups. They're not carrying much stuff around with them. There's not a lot of accumulation of capital, and that makes it less likely that someone can hold power over someone else, right? One person is not going to be employing another person in the group or putting them into slavery or something like that. Like it's simply not possible. And so one really great anecdote that they had was that a young girl, 14-year-old girl, actually decided to be a blowpipe hunter. And they have a pretty strict division of labor, but even so, there's no rule against a woman hunting. They just kind of end up not doing it because of the later demands of childcare. But this woman or girl at this point was quite interested in it, and she hunted for a couple years. She had a blowpipe. There's even pictures of her. It's fantastic. And she eventually stopped doing it, but it kind of shows the permissiveness, and that's part of egalitarianism. But at the same time, they're highly interdependent. This is the key part of hunter-gatherer societies, going back to your comments in cooperation, is that they share a lot of food with each other, with one another across the camp, but at the same time they're not kind of bossing each other around. So that's really interesting. One very famous example that I'm sure you know of, David, is when the anthropologist Richard Lee went to live with the Kung one day, and this was in southern Africa. One day he brought a cow that he had bought, and this was for Christmas, and he thought, oh, well, people will love this. It's my
I love
gift,
this.
right?
Yeah.
And he wrote a paper about it called "Eating Christmas in the Kalahari."
Yeah.
And almost immediately, people started kind of insulting the cow, saying it was just a bag of bones and so
What an
on.
insult.
Yeah, exactly. And so his whole kind of strategy uh, sort of fell apart. But it was part of the society that this idea of cooling the heart of the hunter. So even when good hunters come into camp uh, with an antelope or whatever, there'll be some lady at the back saying, yeah, it's just not fat enough, and so on. And this is a way of kind of a low cost way of reducing the chance that someone is going to turn their hunting prowess into status and power. So
And
it's
there's
very
also
interesting how
there's other
egalitarianism.
conventions like
Yeah,
uh, the game is owned by the person who made the arrow or something like that. So basically it's not even owned by the person who the person who killed it. And an anecdote I
exactly.
remember, it was a Malaysian tribe, it might even be the people you studied, was that whether water was a scarce resources depended on the season. I mean, during the wet season, water was everywhere. But during the dry season, you might have to travel to get it. And they actually had two different words for water for those contexts, water from far away and water from close by. The
Okay,
meaning being that if it was water from far away, you had to share it. But if
right.
it was from close by, then you didn't. And so this was more than I mean, it's almost as if like there's a whole arsenal of mechanisms. There's ridicule, there's humor, but there's
Exactly.
also like who owns it in the first place.
Hmm.
And of course, real sanctions against being alone or eating alone, or I mean, basically restricting the the opportunity to do this. All of that. I mean, you're the one, you're the expert, but that's what I
Yeah.
get from my reading. So
No, exactly. Like those are the cross-cultural patterns, and yeah, that's exactly right. And to go back to Boehm briefly, he kind of argued that these are sorts of ways of kind of reducing within group variation, and food sharing is part of this. Is that if you get a big um, uh, kill, that it gets shared kind of evenly. So it's not like there's one guy who's getting all the protein and fat and getting really powerful while the others are starving. So that kind of produces a very interesting evolutionary effect that has been the topic of kind of a lot of papers and debate. But
yeah, and so as we have a lot of ground to cover, but one is that what the research shows is that hunter-gatherer groups, I think, in the present and as far as we know in the past, members were not closely related to each other. It's not as if that all of this started out as like, close, you know, close genetic relatives. It seems as far back as we can trace, and certainly in modern hunter-gatherer societies, the average degree of genetic relatedness among the people who are actually working together is quite low. So could you expand upon that a bit? Because that's like shocking. So many people will reflexively think, well, at first this was kin selection and then it went on from there.
yeah,
But not as far as we know that these were the average band of people living and working together was the degree of genetic relatedness was quite low. So I wanted to nail down that point.
yeah, exactly. So that was a science paper back in 2011 by Kim Hill and a number of other authors, and it's exactly what you're saying. Is if you calculate kind of relatedness within residential camps, it ends up being we could say surprisingly low, and I say surprisingly because much of the previous thinking about these bands or residential groups is that they consisted of like only close kin, in which case maybe kin selection is a good way to explain why people are cooperating. But the reason this was in science and was such a big finding was that, well, okay, this shows that we need kind of other mechanisms to explain uniquely human aspects um, of cooperation. Now that being said, there's also been some papers out recently that look at how food is kind of shared uh, within camps, and so a paper from Andrea Migliano's group from a few years ago showed that a lot of food sharing occurs kind of preferentially within the kin clusters within a residential group, and they talk about this as kind of a feature of multi-level society and hunter-gatherers. So it's not to totally discount the role of kin or even kin selection. There are ways that you can kind of favor your kin even within uh, that context. But nevertheless, it was a very transformational paper. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I remember from the literature that that certain categories of food are shared more assiduously than others, and that in a gathering context, if you're in a group and you're gathering and there's plenty around, it's just a matter of how much effort you're putting in. Then eating what you gather is a way to prevent free riding. So that and the system is contextual enough so that it could be we assiduously share this food, but we don't assiduously share this food. You have to you eat what you catch, and that's not against um, the basic hypothesis of egalitarianism.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that what the recent literature, and thank you for sharing it with me. I have you to thank for me catching up on the literature. It's kind of it's 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 outlining a traditional view in which hunter-gatherer society was, small groups wandering the landscape, and then agriculture happened. And it's making the point that no, actually, hunter-gatherer society became quite large and large scale before the advent of agriculture. And I know from our conversations that that first view might be a straw man view in the first place, that if you go back to the Man the Hunter, you should tell us a little bit about that
Yeah, yeah,
conference, because that evidently was like one hell of an event in terms
yeah.
of, setting the stage. So tell us about that. And then this issue of what the band is, and whether its importance and where it fit within a larger population structure. And this is very much getting into your own work.
Yeah, so let's start with Man the Hunter. So this was a conference at the University of Chicago in 1966, and it was organized by Sherwood Washburn, a very famous anthropologist and kind of the leading figure in the field at the time. Uh, Saltax, based at University of Chicago, and then two of Washburn's graduate students, Richard Lee and Irv DeVore. And this conference was basically organized to bring together experts in hunter-gatherer studies and ask, what do we know about diversity and variation in hunter-gatherers, and what can that tell us about human origins? So this is a watershed event because it's really the first time with kind of thinking in kind of modern evolutionary terms about what hunter-gatherers can say about human evolution. And there's a lot to say about this conference, but what I'll highlight is is the main conclusion, and this is kind of driven by Lee and DeVore, who were in their late 20s at the time. They came up with this idea of the nomadic style, or what's called the nomadic-egalitarian model. So the idea is, what were hunter-gatherers like modally? What were they like most of the time? And the argument was that they were nomadic, so they move around a lot. They live in pretty small groups, so you have a residential size, like a band size of 25 or so, and more on that in a moment. There's limited food storage, um, and they're highly egalitarian, and this is linked to all these other factors, right? As I talked about, if you don't accumulate material resources, it's more likely that you'll just end up being among equals. So this has kind of served as the basis for thinking uh, about hunter-gatherers. Now, there's been recent challenges to this idea, namely the idea of the small group size, small bands, right?
Yeah.
Arguing that larger scale cooperation may have emerged pretty early in human evolution, or in our species evolution, and that this idea of the small groups, of being nomadic, of being egalitarian, that this is kind of a limited view. And so there's, I would say, like three kind of main papers in the past 5 years that have come out talking about this. And I think they make an important contribution, which is to point out that there is a lot of diversity. And this is pointed out at Man the Hunter, that not all hunter-gatherers, if we define it as subsisting off of wild food resources, not all of them are nomadic and egalitarian. And the Exhibit A is the Pacific Northwest cultures, right? They
Yeah.
had
And that was
slavery.
always, I
They
mean, way back then, that's
exactly.
why this is, perhaps a bit of a straw man.
Yeah.
People were noting them as an exception a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. So we know that there's variation, and this was noted at um, Man the Hunter. But I think the question is, when did these capabilities to interact in large groups come online, like psychological capability to do that? And then when do we see sort of the evidence for it? Um, so I can briefly outline what some of these papers say, which is
Yeah, please
that
do. This is like super important, I think, because it's so important to bring this to the attention of a broad audience. Or take as much time as you want just outlining this, because we're right up to the present now in terms of current
yeah,
research and scholarship on hunter-gatherer society.
right. So I will start with the 2019 paper by Rebecca and Doug Bird at Penn State, as well as Brian Cotting, and I think a few others as well. Um, and sort of the title is like Variability in Social Organization. Hunter-gatherers do not live in small scale societies. And this is a really interesting paper because it kind of outlines the history of thinking about um, hunter-gatherer bands and scale and so on. And they talk about the Man the Hunter Conference. But then they raise this issue that rather than living in kind of these small groups, that actually hunter-gatherers are related to others across the landscape, that they have trade relationships, that their world basically is much larger than we've kind of given it credit for. And then they use their own fantastic ethnography from Australia to illustrate this. Um, and part of the argument was kind of related to this idea of the patrilocal band, which was a prominent part of Man the Hunter in the sense that it was being overturned then. So people thought that uh, the kind of typical hunter-gatherer group was related males, almost chimpanzee-like, like related males who were kind of engaging in warfare and so on. And then females would disperse for marriage and so on. And that this was kind of how hunter-gatherers were, but Man the Hunter actually challenged that, saying that it was more kind of bilocal dispersal. But anyway, so the the Bird paper from 2019, and then more recently, Boyd and Richerson came out with
Long, long paper on just example after example
right.
of evidence for cooperation at the scale of 100 or 200.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And this largely takes the form of things like game drives, which I think they make a good point that this was probably more common in the past when there were, frankly, more animals out there after humans came along in I think larger numbers. This is no longer the case, but yeah, game drives where you can kind of push animals into spaces where you could then kill them. And I actually live just an hour from one of the really famous examples of this called Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. You can go visit it today. It's just a small cliff, really, but it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But I mean, it's just spectacular to think about this. For about 10,000 years, indigenous peoples around here were using this cliff to channel buffalo on the plains and into this kind of corridor where they then scare them into a stampede and they fall off a cliff in basically what has been called the largest mass slaughter in human prehistory.
yeah, and this
So much
involved the
killing.
erection of fences, stone fences, and something that were like kilometers long, right? I mean, many kilometers long, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you can actually still see that on the landscape here in this particular case. And so this would have been a big cooperative event, right? Like you need a lot of people to channel these herds. And so the basic point of the Boyd and Richardson article is that maybe this was happening more in the past than we've previously thought. And they even point to bison kills from 400,000 years ago, right? That's even before modern humans came along. And yeah, it's just a really nice collection of case studies. And then the most recent paper by my two friends, Manvir Singh and Luke Lewacki, kind of challenges the nomadic egalitarian model um, as a way of thinking about what human groups were like in the past in kind of a modal sense. And so they take those principles I outlined from, outlined at Man the Hunter and say, kind of challenging these one by one, arguing that there was probably more stratification, there was occupation of richer habitats in the past. This links with debates around hunter-gatherers that the modern hunter-gatherers have been pushed into pretty marginal habitats that they're only occupying because they've been pushed there by state societies. And there's a very long history around this we could talk about if you want. Um, and yeah, I mean that's sort of the argument, but saying that maybe denser aggregations of hunter-gatherers were more common in the past. And their target really, they published this in Evolution Human Behavior. Their target was really evolutionary psychologists who often talk about sort of the small world of hunter-gatherers as shaping human psychology.
Right, right. So
And
this is a
so
critique of at least some versions of evolutionary psychology. Is actually that's quite pronounced in their introductions and so on. Is that that evolutionary psychologists have been making too much of the very small scale and then which turns large scale society into an enigma.
Yep.
something that could only evolve
Exactly.
by cultural evolution. And so that's one of the things that they're um, they're critiquing. Yeah, maybe say a little bit about our work in The Dawn of Everything, which had a huge impact and is making some of these points. But I think I know, talking with you and others, quite a few people have mixed reactions to that book. They like some aspects of it, but they critique other aspects. And maybe we could work in a little mini review of that particular book because it has been
Yeah,
so
yeah. I
influential.
think it's a good thing to mention because I would say that the Dawn of Everything is basically making these same points. The Dawn of Everything is a big book. You can argue whether it's accessible or not. It's like
Oh, it's a
500
wonderful
plus
book. I
pages.
loved it.
Yeah, yeah,
I ate it up. So,
yeah. It's certainly an exciting book. But they kind of make some of the same points that uh, denser aggregations of people goes back longer than we thought. And they kind of pose this egalitarian origins idea as something of a fantasy based in the kind of the Rousseauian tradition, right? And so they basically say that hunter-gatherer scholars who kind of entertain the idea of egalitarian origins are kind of living in some kind of fantasy world that there was always fighting and dominance interactions and so on in the past. And I think I have a lot to say about that, but I'll just introduce kind of what the main thesis is. And they as evidence they point to mainly um, kind of ice age examples of scaled up social behavior and organization. And those are really cool examples. They're really interesting. But one of the critiques that anthropologist Chris Knight had was that the book is called The Dawn of Everything, but he calls
that's
it,
not
well, it's
dawn. That's
it's
like
he
mid-morning.
well he calls it is the tea time of everything. Right. So the human species is at least 300,000 years old, but you can't really start your narrative at 50,000 years ago. It leaves a lot unexplained. And in fact, it kind of leaves the problem unexplored, frankly.
Okay. Okay. That's very interesting indeed. So,
So I don't know how we want to proceed. I could talk about um, some critiques of those previous papers or the dawn of everything specifically. Um,
well,
yeah,
I'd like to make a few points and maybe bring
sure.
in multi-level selection, which has been in the background here, and bring it a little bit more into the foreground and offer some of my own um, thoughts as a very well informed outsider. So it's not as if like I do this kind of research, but I've read plenty of it. I've had Chris Boehm as a close associate and so on and um, so forth. And so one point I want to make is that when a society becomes structured, that doesn't mean it has ceased to become egalitarian. And I think um, the dawn of everything might have made the same point. And one of the classic anthropological books that I love is The Ritual Process by Victor Turner, written in the 1970s, in which he made kind of two distinctions for um, human societies, which he called structure and communitas.
Mhm.
Communitas was the egalitarian spirit. That was the spirit of egalitarianism in which everyone was a moral equal. Structure was the structure that's required for society to operate at any but the tiniest scales. And often it is hierarchical. It doesn't just seem hierarchical, it is. There might be hereditary chiefs or big men or whatever. But the great question is to what extent the structure is anchored in communitas and that the structure actually, despite the hierarchy, is also oriented towards the welfare of everyone. And you have examples of big men, for examples, and they have all the
Mhm.
stuff, but they're like serving as some kind of central bank. They're like distributing that stuff. And if they misbehave, there's the same kind of corrections, bottom up control that that is what reverse dominance always was. So the mere fact of structure and hierarchy is actually not telling you what whether this has become a despotic society like a chimp society, which is truly run for the benefit of the elites, or whether it is actually remains anchored in egalitarianism. And for
Mhm.
Turner, he credited ritual with that anchor. Basically, the ritual is what keeps structure anchored to communitas. And I think that all of that, I would love to think, is remains solid. And maybe I could ask you to comment on that, because that, I think, really, when we take that seriously, it just informs the way we look at structure, and we don't make the mistake of confusing structure with despotism, or a lack of egalitarianism. So let me have you comment on that piece, and then I'll take another step.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think this is one of the fascinating points that is made in the Dawn of Everything. They point to this early Ukrainian city, basically that they argue shows the hallmarks of a kind of a scaled up society, but one that isn't necessarily despotic, and they infer this by their interpretation of the archaeology. I'm not terribly qualified to comment on how accurate that interpretation is. I've seen some uh, debate about it, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. I'd like to ask your opinion about that specific case, actually, but first I'll note something that comes to mind, and um, in in this idea of bottom-up control is that leaders in hunter-gatherer societies are often reluctant leaders, right? They kind of perform services for their group. But the question is, what benefits do they get? And there's a fantastic book called Society Against the State by Pierre Clost, where he um, works with this Amazonian hunter-gatherer group and has this fantastic description of how the chief is basically just a puppet in a way of the group. So he talks about the chief as being the most impoverished person there, where he's sitting there, he's expected to make these speeches extolling the moral virtues of the group. He's expected to give all of his belongings away to sort of serve everyone else. Um, the only thing he gets in exchange apparently is women.
Well,
This is
not a
what
bad
Quest
exchange, by the
argues.
way,
I guess not.
from an evolutionary perspective.
Well, right.
I mean,
But it sort of puts this idea of being a leader in not so rosy terms. And I would encourage anyone. I actually have the book. It's a really fantastic book. You should check it out. So that's what reminds me of that. But I mean, what are your thoughts on the possibility of these egalitarian cities? Because someone like Peter Turchin would argue, well, I mean, he did argue in his review of Dawn of Everything that once you start scaling up, that you introduce these issues that need to be solved through institutions that naturally
yeah,
become more hierarchical. So
exactly.
how do you see that tension playing out?
Well, I see it as very reminiscent, and in the dawn of everything, that I thought they were quite balanced. I didn't say that all cities were like this,
Sure.
and I think they actually had the same view that you and I would, that it's based on the concentration of resources. And so that if you had concentrations of resources, then you did get kind of elite capture, you might say, and that it was elsewhere that you would have the more egalitarian. So they would have, I
Right.
think, if I read them correctly, talk about a spectrum. Now we fast forward to the present,
Hmm.
and you get Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, winners of the most recent recipients of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and their work, including their book "Why Nations Fail." They say that modern nations vary uh, on a spectrum from inclusive to extractive, are the words that they used, and they're all structured. Of course, any modern nations has all kinds of structure and hierarchy, but in the case of inclusive nations, then the benefits are much more widely shared than in the
Right.
case of extractive nations. We should expect that's exactly what we should expect about the past.
Hmm.
Nothing more. nothing less. The past is like the present. And so I think that, and then we can get the wonderful work of Peter Turchin and others are more or less adding granularity um, to that. So I think that, I mean, one of the things that I love about these recent developments is the idea that before agriculture, if by agriculture we mean domesticated plants and animals, there was an entire phase of like major habitat manipulation
Hmm.
at, and that's why hunter-gatherer society could become large scale before agriculture, but because before agriculture we
Yeah.
had, like we were like beavers. We talk about beavers as keystone ecosystem engineers modifying their habitat. That's how we were, and that's why we could generate huge surpluses
Hmm.
um, before agri agriculture, and then that required a much larger scale of society than band scale society. And that now brings me to the point where I'll turn it back to you. I think what you want to say is that, first of all, you want to agree with a lot of this, but you also want to say that nevertheless, the band represents a very important unit. And if we want to go back from the tea time of everything to the dawn of everything, then I think that would be true even more so because much as we're uh, as what we're saying is amazing and wonderful, run back, 50 or 100,000 years or whatever. When you run it back still further, actually, you are left with small groups wandering the
Yeah.
landscape. You're back
Yeah.
to the original conception. I mean, probably you are. So let me take your turn, and then I want to say more about the scale of society and population structure. But you have a lot to offer at this point.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, I guess first what I'll say is what's really interesting um, about some of these new papers is that they don't actually contain much original data. They're actually citing kind of older reports, pu published stuff, right? And I don't mean that in any disparaging way. I mean it's interesting from an intellectual perspective. Theory always informs how we view the world, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So that means that there's been some kind of theoretical shift that has led to a kind of reinterpretation of these observations.
That's a great point.
And I'll go back to Man the Hunter because this is something that I um, study a lot in thinking about the intellectual history of hunter-gatherers. And even though, like, one of the main conclusions of the conference was that hunter-gatherers live in small groups, it's important to read around that as well. When you look at the book, there's chapter after chapter talking about exogamy, about intergroup interactions, about ethno-linguistic groups, about territorialism. So even in this earliest conception of hunter-gatherers, even though the sort of lived experience is in a band, there was always the recognition that you had to find marriage partners elsewhere, that a group of 25 is not a demographically viable unit. And in fact, the way
And there
they
wouldn't be a
define,
language group. There could not be a language group without that
yeah,
language group being certainly larger than a band. I mean, so that was
exactly.
always implied. Um,
Yeah. And so when they defined small scale societies in Man the Hunter, it wasn't 25, it was 1,000, right? Um, so I think it just adds a little nuance here to saying, okay, we've had this major shift in how we think about it. I think that it has kind of always been there. It kind of pushes the question to be, well, why haven't evolutionary psychologists read the ethnography close enough, which is its own sort of question. But again, there's mention after mention in Man the Hunter about what we would now recognize as multi-level sociality, as interband interactions. It's actually very rich in that, and I think that needs to be pointed out. Now, I think what we're seeing though is that in recognizing that there is more to hunter-gatherer life than the band, that it extends beyond that, is that it's really just saying that hunter-gatherers live in multi-level societies. And this then begs the question of why, right? What are the functional benefits at each level of of organization. And there's been a lot of research on that in the past few years. So it would now be a good time to maybe just walk through what those levels are and what we think
Yeah,
about them. Yeah.
yeah. You want to
So,
take the lead, or go ahead?
well, yeah, I can just start and we can digress as we.
Yeah, no, you start, and then I'll maybe put more of a formal multi-level selection gloss on it.
Sure,
So,
yeah.
but you go ahead and start.
Um, well, so first there's sort of the family group, right? So the kind of nuclear family, and you have divisions of labor, sexual divisions of labor in a household. Typically hunting by men, gathering by women, providing a kind of balanced, complementary, nutritional base, right? And they cooperate to raise their offspring. These exist, of course, in the broader network of kin within a camp. So the study I mentioned earlier, where you have, let's say, a little hunter-gatherer camp, and there'll be little neighborhoods of kin within that. Studies have shown that there's a lot of food sharing that goes on within these kin units. So that, let's say, your nuclear family fails to get food on a certain day, well, you can fall back on your sister living next door, right? Now, very early models in behavioral ecology applied to humans, uh, most notably, one by Bruce Winterhalter, basically showed that you need about eight hunters in a group to buffer the risk, given certain levels of probability of failure, right? So going back to the earlier part of the conversation, if you're going after unreliable food items, you need a large enough group to be buffering that risk. And so when you look at the band, which contains 25 to 30 uh, people that shares widely, we can kind of see the band as operating as kind of a foraging unit that is sharing food, that's moving mobilely across the landscape. We did a study of how hunter-gatherers move across the landscape. This was focused on the Batek using historical data. And in fact, this was kind of my own uh, origin of
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thinking
yeah. Tell
about,
us about it. This is your own work.
yeah, yeah, of thinking about kind of multi-level selection and groups is we basically applied the marginal value theorem to the movement of hunter-gatherer bands. So, you know, what is the timing of movement between patches, right? This is Charnoff's model, and the decision rule is that you should move when your rate of acquisition falls to some threshold level of what you can sort of determined by what you can find elsewhere and what you can expect to find in the environment, right? And so we kind of tallied up all the food that's coming into the environment, sorry, that's coming from the environment, and that is then shared equally among members, and showed that once it starts to plateau a little bit, that's when the hunter-gatherers would relocate their camps. So this shows basically group level foraging efficiency maximization. Again, at the group level. And I was kind of puzzled when we found this, like, oh, this is so neat, but how are they achieving it? And this is what led to my more recent work on the function of egalitarianism as a information processing adaptation, essentially. Maybe we can get into that later, but we
Well,
can
I
treat the
think that,
band as kind of an adaptive unit, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably this is now, I think, probably a good way to conclude part one of our conversation, and then to schedule another session for part two. And in
Mm,
part two, I think we'll be a little more explicit about multi-level selection, and then we'll go to what this all means for modern society and democracy. And I'm so happy that you began as a philosopher, because I think that when we go to um, what's called classical liberalism, this is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville and Tocqueville, Democracy in America, basically the
mhm,
origin of the whole concept of democracy and all the revolutions. That's um, uh, there's something very hunter-gathererish about it, and that there's this huge
mhm,
emphasis on individual. Must be a sense in which this what we do is in the interest of the individuals, and the individuals can say no. That was like a huge part of classical liberalism, and yet at the same
Yeah.
time, it has to be for the good of the group. Somehow this has to lead to societies that function well as societies. So, and doesn't that look just like uh, reverse dominance and hunter-gatherer society? Is it not? I mean, isn't that a match? Isn't that a fit? And that's a very important point to establish, because in the recent books that I've been reading on this subject, they're almost like they're saying that the foundation for classical liberalism has been kind of eroded in recent times. It doesn't really have the kind of authoritative base that it
Hmm.
should. And then those books go on to provide a new foundation for this. But that foundation is not as well informed. It's a little bit informed by evolution, but not as much as
Hmm.
it needs to be. And so
It could
that's what
be.
I
Yeah.
think is so important about this, is that there is a sense in which we can say that modern large-scale society does need to be anchored in, right back to Victor Turner, communitas, basically. There has to be, and there does have to be agency at the lower levels, and not just individuals. I mean, because modern society is so multi-level, at any
Hmm.
level, small groups, and then we get to concepts like federalism and subsidiarity, and these
Right.
are all the multi-level institutions that have evolved. Um, the need for participation, all of these things which define, I think, modern liberal democracy, which is being threatened by authoritarian regimes and so on and so forth. And so I think there can be no more important point to make than uh, that we can, as we try to formulate and justify democracy as we know it, that we can say that in some sense this is what human nature demands,
Hmm.
and that um, and so that's what we're I think we've made one big step in this conversation, and we'll take another big step in our other conversation. What I want to say in preparation about multi-level selection, I think,
Hmm.
is that multi-level selection theory is always has to specify what we call a multi-group population structure in addition to the group. So all sizable populations are multi-group populations. The social interactions take place in relatively small groups, but then those groups are connected to each other uh,
Hmm.
in a multi-group population. And if we just take that basic conception, which we apply to all species when we talk about multi-level selection, and we apply that to humans, what we find is that the band is one of these smaller units. That's one of the units in which so the social interactions actually take place.
Hmm.
And then there's the population structure, the multi-group population structure, which can be, must be much larger. And so that's not new. And I don't think that was ever ignored. How could you
Right.
not ignore that?
Right.
But we could be more explicit about it. And
Hmm.
another point to make, I think, is that this is true for many species. Um, and it's implicit in the concept of trait groups, which is my main early contribution to this
Hmm.
subject, is that uh, groups must be defined in reference to particular traits. If you're foraging, then that's one kind of group. If you're hunting, that's another kind of group. If you're conducting warfare, that's still another kind of group. If you're trading, that's still another kind of group. And each
Right.
group, there's a bit of autonomy in the evolution of all of these contexts. When we talk about the evolution of alarm calls in birds, we're invoking a different grouping than if we're talking about the evolution of territoriality in in birds. So there's many groups, and those groups must be defined in reference um, to traits. And And you see that in spades with humans. I mean, part of the genius of being human all the way, certainly in the present and all the way back to the dawn, not just the teach.
Yeah.
Humans participate in many kinds of groupings, and danged if they don't understand the context for each grouping. Each grouping has its own norms. I mean, amazing that we can pass in and out of so many different kinds of groups and understand the context and do the right thing for each grouping. Sociologists like Irving Goffman pointed that out a long time ago. That's the essence of his work, the presentation of the self in um, everyday life. So we have to take that into account. And then finally, my final point
Yeah.
before we end part one, it turns out that movement, the ability to move from one group to another, which in classical, in the early days of um, was used as a critique against group selection, that if there was a lot of movement, how could there be variation among groups if everyone was moving between groups? But why now we know that when movement is conditional, that we're just not moving at random. We're moving because there's some asshole in my group and I want to get away from him. Then then movement becomes a powerful positive force in generation. It's thanks to movement that group selection works as well as it does. And
Mm.
that movement, assortative interactions, the fact that I get to choose to interact with you and not to interact with him, that's that is even stronger than kin selection in generating the most important kind of variation among groups. And so that which was regarded as an argument against group selection becomes the best argument for it. And so I think we'll be elaborating on this plus more in part two. But let me thank you for part one, and then so great to make this available to a large audience through this podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've covered a lot of really great terrain, and there's certainly more to cover as well, about hunter-gatherers and multi-level sociality. So yeah, thanks, David.
Yep. Okay. Until next time.
Yeah.
Bye bye.